All right, Steph, you ready to take this?
I am so ready. No, I had a lot of fun putting together this month's educational topic. As the learning committee got together last month and we were kind of looking towards, what educational topics do we want to cover in the next few months? We landed on, it's April 20th. Earth Day's here in a couple days, so we're really close. We figured it'd be a really good time just to kind of remind folks of what the history of Earth Day is. Where did this come from? How did it start? What are we trying to do? Where is it going? So we're going to just talk about that for a little bit. And then as I was doing my research, it was really interesting to see how much the history of Northeast Ohio is actually kind of connected to the emergence of the movement for environmentalism in the US in the late 20th century. So if we were all together in a room, I'd ask for a show of hands, but some of you might be familiar with the beer company, Great Lakes Brewing Company, and they have a beer that is called Burning River Pale Ale. If you're like me and you're not originally from Ohio, you might be wondering, why is it called Burning River? What's that about? Well, this is actually a reference to a fire that took place on the river in 1969. So on June 22nd of 1969, the Cuyahoga River actually burst into flames when there were sparks from a train that passed by, and the sparks from the train set fire to some debris that was soaked in oil and was floating on the water's surface. Now, this 1969 fire is the most well-known fire on the Cuyahoga River, but actually the river has caught fire several times earlier in the 20th century, and it just never really got a ton of coverage because everyone kind of assumed, in Cleveland being an industrial town, it was just kind of, hey, that's the cost of progress. That's the cost we have to pay if we want to industrialize and move forward and progress as a country. So when I looked into the history of this, you can see here that there are no less than 10 times that the Cuyahoga River has caught on fire from 1868 all the way up to 1969. So this was not the first time that this was going to happen, but it was the one that got the most coverage. Jess, if we could go to the next slide. Excuse me. So Time magazine actually covered the 1969 fire, but when they did that, they published a photo that was actually from an earlier and more damaging fire on the river that took place in 1952. So the 1969 fire actually wasn't the most dramatic one, but because of this little editorial mishap, it ended up looking like it was a bigger event than it really was, and it got a ton of attention. The 1969 fire actually came after a 1968 passage of a $100 million bond initiative to fund the cleanup of the river. So even before the 1969 fire, citizens of Cleveland already understood that this environmentalism thing was kind of important, and maybe we should clean up our waterways, because I don't know about you guys, but I'm pretty sure that water in the river is not supposed to catch on fire. We really don't like that, and we don't like to see that. So while that initial fire in 1969 didn't receive a ton of attention, because of the editorial mishap at Time magazine and because of the growing environmentalism movement, it became a symbol for that movement as we moved into the 70s. Jess, if we could move to the next slide. And that is so convenient because April 1970 is when we had the first Earth Day. So Senator Gaylord Nelson created Earth Day in 1970 as a way to kind of force the issue of environmentalism onto the national agenda. So he created this, declared that this was going to be Earth Day. And as a result, 20 million Americans demonstrated on the first Earth Day across the country in all sorts of different US cities to raise awareness for the cause of environmentalism. As you can see here, here's a picture from the first Earth Day in 1970, where Fifth Avenue in New York City was absolutely chock-a-block, filled with thousands of people marching and demonstrating for the cause of environmentalism. And so following that, in December of 1970, and again, as a result of the work of Senator Nelson, Congress authorized the creation of a new federal agency that was dedicated to tackling environmental issues, and that was the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA. Jess, if we could move to the next slide. This one is so cool to see. just because sometimes I think when we are in the current day and we're trying to get movement on issues that matter to us, it's really easy to think that things are moving too slowly, we're not getting enough done, and we're never going to make progress. And I really like looking at this list because this is just the list of following the first Earth Day in 1970 up to 1980. This is how much legislation got passed related to environmentalism. And this is a lot of what is fundamental to our national environmentalism movement. So that includes, but it's not limited to, things like the Clean Water and Air Act, the Water Quality Improvement Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Toxic Substances Control Act. These are all really important things. The Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, and some of these, if you think about not even just, current events in Ohio, we've had a number of sort of environmentally concerning events in Ohio just this year, but also the history of Ohio, especially if you go into the northern parts of Ohio, the eastern parts of Ohio, we have some connections to mining. And what is the environmental impact of that? And so trying to control for that. So it is really cool to see what can get done when people are dedicated to making something happen. So I just like to look at this list and remind myself that, like, this, this all exists because someone said, hey, I don't think rivers are supposed to catch on fire. I don't think, smog is supposed to blanket, my city so that I can't see the sunrise and the sunset. I don't think that's supposed to happen. We should definitely do something about that. Jess, if we could move to the next slide. So then let's go back to Cleveland. What about Cleveland? We talked about the environmentalism movement at a national level, but what about Cleveland? Well, environmental legislation wasn't always easy. And initially, President Nixon vetoed the Clean Water Act in 1972 because he was concerned about the price tag. However, thankfully, the Senate voted to override his veto, and they passed the Clean Water Act into law. Which was really important because only a couple years earlier, scientists had concluded that Lake Erie was actually dying due to pollution that was raising phosphorus levels in the lake. And so some of you might be familiar with phosphorus is a chemical that is commonly found in agricultural, sort of industrial fertilizers. And so as a result of runoff, that phosphorus was going into the lake, and those elevated phosphorus levels were leading to algal blooms. So these are just big blooms of algae that were threatening the well-being of the lake. I had to do a little bit of research to understand this, like, what is an algal bloom and why is it bad? Basically, what happens with algal blooms is they can radically raise the pH level, sort of like the acidity level of the water that it's in. And it can also affect the ability of animals like fish and other marine life to actually be able to access oxygen in the water. So when we talk about the lake dying from these phosphorus levels going up, it is quite literally fish were dying. Marine life was dying. So this was actually a pretty big concern for folks living around Lake Erie and around the Great Lakes more generally, but particularly Lake Erie, because this was killing off the river. Killing off the lakes. And so that Clean Water Act was really important to get passed in 1972 so that we could start to address the causes of that. Jess, if we could move to the next slide, you'll see that in addition to the Clean Water Act that was passed in 1972, the US and Canada actually had two Great Lakes water quality agreements in 1972 and in 1978, where they agreed that they would begin the process of cleaning the Great Lakes. And so it was federal legislation like the Clean Water Act that provided the means to address those new threats or those existing threats to what is the largest freshwater system in the world. Like the Great Lakes are great for a reason. It's not just because they're a ton of fun or that they're really pretty. They are the largest freshwater system on the entire planet. And so it is very important that we are able to protect them and preserve that for later generations. Jess, if we could move to the next slide. So we talked about Cleveland. I also want to talk about something called the Montreal Protocol. In the 1970s, again, along with that environmentalism movement, scientists were able to identify that increased fossil fuel usage was having a really negative impact on the environment, and particularly on the ozone shield. So the ozone shield, if you're not familiar with the concept of the ozone shield, this is a layer of ozone gas that is really high up in our atmosphere around the planet. And that ozone shield actually protects us from the majority of the damaging ultraviolet radiation that comes from the sun. So when that ozone shield began to degrade, you can see over here on the right, we have sort of this visualization of what that heat map would look like. So as the ozone shield was degrading, that top left corner, that's in 1979. And that shows, like, you can see these little bits of orange and yellow where the atmosphere is really starting to warm up. And there's very, very little of that deep blue, which is what we want to see. But as a result of these efforts following the Montreal Protocol, we see that in 1989, which is at the top right, we do start to see more of that blue. And then as we progress to, what is that, 2006 and then 2010, in that lower quadrant there, you can see that the ozone layer has actually begun to heal, which is really cool. So in 1987, every country in the world joined the Montreal Protocol to ban CFCs, which are a major ozone depleting pollutant. And in 2010, scientists were able to report that the ozone shield was beginning to recover. This is actually really, really cool, just to know that, like, just that kind of effort, it was a big effort, it was a collective effort, but it is having a positive impact, and we are starting to see improvement in that ozone shield. And so ozone depleting emissions are actually down 99% since 1979. And so the ozone layer is projected to return to 1980 levels by the middle of this century. Now, we would still love to see it happen faster than that, but we are on track to actually make some improvement to all the environmental damage that we've seen in the past 30, 40 years. So this, I think, is really important to remind ourselves, is like, it's very easy sometimes when we talk about environmentalism and climate change, it's very easy to kind of get into a really doom and gloom state of things because, you know, we can see so much bad that is happening. But I think this is a great reminder that if we all come together and decide that we want to change things and we want to say, hey, we've got to make this better, we absolutely can do that. So I just thought that was a really good reminder for us to end on. Jess, I think we've got one slide left, and that's to talk about Earth Day 2023. So the theme of Earth Day 2023 is that we need to invest in our planet. This theme was selected because it highlights the importance of dedicating our time, our resources, our energy to solving climate change and those other environmental issues. So investing in our planet is necessary to protect it. And the best way that we can pave a path towards that really prosperous future that we all want for our planet and for ourselves. So some of the ways that we can invest in Earth Day is investing in things like regenerative agriculture, investing in food security, the restoration of biodiversity, which is a big focus of this organization. That's the main reason that Wild Ones exists, is to promote that restoration of biodiversity. We can also invest in the green economy and bigger, more sort of general efforts to restore climate. That is not an exhaustive list. This is just a few things that I was able to pick from earthday.org of ideas or topics that you can look into if you want to research these further. But I think, this is a really good jumping off point for us to think about. What are you going to do on Earth Day to invest in our planet? And so if you want to learn more about this, you can go to earthday.org to find out more about how you can take action. Or we could make things really easy for you. If you'd like to volunteer for a Wild Ones Earth Day event, please just let us know, because we would love to see you there. We would love for you to join us as we continue to promote the restoration of our local biodiversity. And that's all I've got. That's all I've got on Earth Day, Jess. Thank you.